It's important for me to get two things out of the way at the off. In the first place, though my own sexuality shouldn't be relevant to a critical discussion of art, the self-anointed inquisitors of the world we're trapped in insist it must be. So, to preempt the usual non-argument that I'm just another fragile straight white male who hates diversity because I'm an irredeemable bigot, I'll say at the outset that I'm not straight, and my objections to this modern trend, which is the subject of our video, don't stem from homophobia, but rather because, unlike most of the inquisitors, I actually care about the proper representation of gay people in art. And I stress the word proper, but we'll come to that argument shortly. Secondly, I am not and do not pretend to be an expert on comics. I approach this as an outsider with a casual interest in the comics themselves. I'm one of those normies whose sole exposure to Marvel and DC is in their respective cinematic universes, for which I offer my profound apologies. I am rather more interested in the comics industry than I am in the comics themselves, precisely because it seems from the outside, and from what is said by those I trust on the inside, that the comics industry has been taken over by people who are about as invested in comics as I am. The difference being that I wouldn't dream of imposing myself on the fans of a genre about which I'm ignorant, while there is a vanguard unit of the Inquisition which is dedicated to no other purpose. Comics are a culture, a nation, even a universe in print. Contemporary politics is not short of people who think it is their right to debase, slander, and destroy the culture of nations not their own. That these people are most likely to complain about imperialism, colonialism in other contexts is the height of irony, given what they are doing conforms perfectly to the definitions of cultural appropriation, cultural imperialism, and cultural colonialism. It is not my right to treat fans of comics as my colonial subjects, extirpating what it is of their culture I find distasteful or offensive. It is, but as politely as possible, deeply fucking irritating that a culture with a history that is so long, rich, and proud is being abused by people who do think that this is their right. It seems indeed as though comics are, perhaps because they've always been to some extent a niche market, much further advanced than films, for example, when it comes to the imposition of social justice narratives. The real money spinner for the comics industry today is, or would seem to be, Hollywood. That at least is the attitude of the major studios and publishers, and is in evidence when you separate out sales of manga, for example, from sales of traditional superhero comics. There really is no reason not to separate these two things, unless your goal is to hide the facts. As Forbes reported, I think, last year, kid-oriented comics and graphic novels constitute 41% of sell-through at bookstores, with manga alone making up 28%, while superhero comics make up less than 10%, and are declining by about 9.8% year-on-year. The trend is actually more pronounced in specialist comic stores, where manga sales rose 41% in 2019 and superhero graphic novel sales sank 15%. For all there are legitimate complaints about the way the MCU in particular has become much more interested in unthinking contemporary feminism, even at the expense of older, cleverer forms of same which were still in evidence just a few years ago, compare the character and construction of Natasha Romanoff with Captain Marvel, for example, these transgressions are tame compared with what fans of comics have had to put up with. There are many examples of this, the idea that messaging is separate from and more important than storytelling. Captain Marvel in film is the example par excellence, but again the comics industry has had to stomach things much less appetizing. Marvel's New Warriors is a kind of blind parody. Had somebody come up with the characters Snowflake, Safe Space, Trailblazer, and Screen Time in a bid to satirize the industry trend, that satire would have been dismissed as too ridiculous to be believed, but that's the state we now find ourselves in. It's been fairly common in recent times to ask what place there is for satire in a culture that is so intent on satirizing itself, but that question should really be extended now to the parodic, given the surrealist, almost slapstick turn we've taken since. Other better and more seasoned critics than I have tackled this in various of its ridiculous dimensions. Rather than reiterate an overview you could get elsewhere, I'm going to concern myself here with just one facet of this cosmic nonsense, and that is the modern fashion for turning established heroes gay. If comic sales had the same growth trajectory as the gay, things in the industry would be rosy. This list is now quite extensive. Batwoman, Robin, The Flash, Superman, Wonder Woman, Hulkling, whatever that is, and Wiccan, Rictor, Shatterstar, that one from the Eternals movie nobody watched, Iceman, Green Lantern. There's also plenty of talk that Spiderman will get at least the buy-in treatment in the near future. Here is a robot passionately setting out the reasons why.
Apart from the traditional and opposite-sex love stories, there are so many LGBT love stories that you can now see in the comics. Superheroes are for everyone. So, it is necessary to represent everyone as well.
This is just bizarre. It's made especially bizarre because in many, if not most cases, the characters coming out are already established. They're being retrofitted with the gay, many within the last 5 years, in the name of representation. But who are they representing and why? Why is it that, rather than writing new heroes and new stories, it has been decided that the most appropriate way to do this is by fast-tracking established characters into the club? Alphabet people, assemble. Could it be because the writers lack the time, the patience, the talent, and the interest to create something from scratch? Could it be because they have decided that representation and storytelling are two different things, and one should take priority over the other? Could it perhaps be because the new breed of people being brought into pen storylines are primarily concerned with inserting themselves and their politics into a recalcitrant medium, to teach the fans a lesson in diversity, rather than giving them characters and stories they like and want to read? I suspect the proper answer is all of the above. And it says something quite important about how woke corporatism views and values its products. I don't believe they're loading this agenda disproportionately on comics because they value the comics they produce. Rather, I suspect they're doing it because they don't value the comics they produce. They aren't the marquee items they once were, and this treatment is notably lacking from items publishers and producers see the dollar value in. Compare gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, and the whole through-the-looking-glass plethora of modern confections and how they're represented in comics with what we get from big-ticket items in films, for example. While Marvel Comics is going about making every established IP it can get away with fabulous, the MCU lacks the balls to go beyond a shallow kind of feminism. Woke capital, where capital is concerned, is 30 or 40 years behind the wider cultural social justice movement. We can then expect to see the gay get the woman treatment in perhaps 15 or 20 years, but not until then. Disney, under which the MCU suffers, famously talks the talk, but it is just as famously risk-averse. While Western audiences were told of a lesbian kiss to look forward to in The Rise of Skywalker, this was in fact relegated to the most fleeting of fleeting scenes, pushed to the side, and took place between characters even quite devoted fans of the sequels, for these morons do exist, would have struggled to name. Meanwhile, Disney airbrushes black stars out of promotional materials in China. It complains about abortion policies reflecting the beliefs of half of all Americans and genuflects on race in America, while in China it deliberately says less than nothing about the actual genocide of minorities in that same country, going to the lengths of thanking regional administrators for letting them film next to concentration camps. This is because there is money involved in film, and film in China in particular. It takes no risks with China, or in China. Its passionate dedication to diversity and representation only makes itself felt where it is safe to make it so. Following which logic, the sheer extent of the wokeification of comics is indicative of a profound lack of regard paid to that medium by its corporate overlords. If it recognized any substantial cost in pushing social justice agendas in comics, it would not push these agendas. That superhero comics and dedicated comic stores are dying suggests their masters see no substantial value in their life. I mentioned my own sexuality at the top, or what little of it you deserve to know given the subsequent argument, in part as an attempt, which is doubtless futile, to forestall the usual non-ripostes about heteronormative fragility or whatever fancy new words were invented yesterday with which to reduce complex criticisms to the most superficial causes. But there is another reason. I mentioned it because, not being straight, I think I'm qualified to comment on the shibboleth that is representation, and the motives and assumptions that underlie it. I am not immune, as I think some other critics perhaps are, though I think also innocently, to the value of representation on screen, on the page, in comics, in music, in literature. Love stories have always been, and will always be, staples of the arts precisely because they are an expression of a human universal. They speak to us, we resonate to them, and to a limited extent we do indeed project onto them. They humanize characters, they provide motives and stakes, they provide or embellish stories, and give us something to invest in. Whole subgenres of fan fiction exist solely for the purpose of shipping characters, creating love stories that either do not exist or were not sufficiently explored in the stories these characters inhabit. A particularly cringe-worthy subgenre of the subgenre sees the fanfiction author shipping an established character with one of their own making, usually one which represents the author in that world. Especially when you're younger, and doubly so when you're privately struggling with something about your nature you don't fully understand, and which you have no form or means of expressing in the real world, or are afraid of the very grammar of, there is an important dual role played by works of fiction on screen or on the page. In the first place, it affords you a completed vision of the thing about yourself you're only glimpsing, without the risk of completing that vision for yourself, which must necessarily involve a degree of public admission that you do genuinely fear. In the second place, it allows for a kind of vicarious expression of same. It helps you understand something about yourself, But it also allows you to pursue this question to its answer in the body of someone other than yourself. It comes, if you like, without any personal cost. This doesn't actually require a clearly and deliberately written gay relationship on screen. All it requires is sufficient ambiguity. All it needs is the possibility. You then can complete that never-finished arc in your own head. Or if you want to run the risk of embarrassing yourself many years later, you can write fanfiction about it. Plenty of people do. There is an extension to this which is at least as important. The story in which you're seeing yourself represented, or which you are vicariously living through, does not actually have to be about you. That is not what makes it effective. What makes it effective predates the romantic aspect. What makes it effective is the story and the characters, both of which have to be well crafted and intelligent if it is to harness your imagination in the first place. Romantic subplots and motivations are as much a part of this rule as any other aspect of any other story and character is. It is not that they exist, but how they exist that makes them stand or fall. Representation alone does not make for a good story. Representation is undermined by bad stories. And making representation a replacement for story makes for bad stories, thereby undermining the very point, the very utility of that representation. You cannot see yourself in a shallow character. You would not wish to inhabit an empty world. It is not then enough to make and to show gay characters. You have to make good characters. You have to make good stories. You can't shirk this requirement or this duty merely by taking an established name, dropping them in some threadbare plotline that would have embarrassed even a fanfiction writer, and put it on the shelves at one of the few remaining comic stores. Taking established heroes and gaying them up can be counterproductive in ways that are related but distinct. Because these are established characters, with their own long histories, with a fixed place in the minds of fans who think they know and understand them, introducing something totally and wholly new at the stroke of a pen, something without any build-up, without any reference to the history of that character and his or her relationships and personality, is jarring. It feels implausible. It is a barrier to understanding, not an aid to it. It feels confected, artificial, forced. It feels this way because it is. And because it isn't relatable. Fans of comics who are themselves questioning their own sexuality will be suddenly presented with a cartoonish version of an ending, with none of the drama, the conflict, the trouble of all that went before. Nothing, in other words, they can actually relate to. It's wrong to pretend being gay today is anything like as difficult or as dangerous as it was in the past. It's so much easier, to the point, in some places and communities, of being dull, which is one of the reasons gayness in those places and communities is becoming ever more extravagant, pushing ever more boundaries. In these cases, though many of these people may have grown up gay, their gayness has never grown up. The whole frame of reference is transgressional, and so it is intolerably dull to be completely accommodated by the society you now find yourself in. You see this increasingly with celebrities, an alarming number of whom have decided that either themselves or their toddlers are transgender. But in other ways, in other places and communities, it does still retain the old fear, the old uncertainty, something of the felt danger it has always had. And I think it will always do so, even in admirably tolerant societies like ours generally are. It is, that is to say, we are, and we will always be, something else, a minority, a little different to our friends and our classmates at school, coming into puberty, which is fraught enough anyway, with one big fraught secret that is not expressed by the conventions of our peers, at just the time of life when peer convention is so important. Gay characters who don't represent this aspect of gayness, who have none of this history, who don't embody any of this struggle, who've been created to represent political ideas of tolerance, acceptance and diversity rather than the lives of real people in all their diversity, have very little to teach us, very little in common with us, very little we can latch on to. This is just as true for straight people and straight characters. This is why the best written superheroes, regardless of their sexuality, are challenged, have weaknesses, have arcs in which, often at great cost, they overcome them. Again, this is a way in which the writing of good gay characters is in formula little different from the writing of good straight characters. They are good characters first and foremost, with engaging and meaningful stories to tell. But, again, the gaying of established characters tends or tries to forego much of this, because these characters are not and have no stories. They exist to be statements, to tell you exactly as much as a poster or billboard advertising any other product does. Good characters may make statements, they should not be statements. Adverts encourage you to look at a product. They are not the product themselves. Whether you buy into that product will depend on the actual merits of that product, whether it matches in substance what the billboard shows as artifice. Finally, we have also to remember that the vast, vast majority of people are not gay, and the vast, 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 vast majority of people are not transgender. These statistics fluctuate, they are necessarily difficult to measure, but even the most liberal estimates do not top 10% of the population writ large when it comes to homosexuality. A much higher proportion of people report having had same-sex feelings or attractions than report being gay or even bisexual, which is evidence of a greater prevalence of bisexuality than people will readily admit. Figures are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, understated because of social attitudes and conventions, not overstated. But even accepting this, the point to be remembered is that representation, when it's made a zero-sum game, is exclusionary. And in gaying established characters, it becomes a zero-sum game, and the people being excluded represent an overwhelming majority of the fanbase. This is not true when a new gay character is created. All new characters start from the bottom and win, or don't, the fans' affection and loyalty because their personalities and their stories are, or are not, compelling. You can create gay characters with mass appeal in this way, normalizing their romantic attractions to the greatest extent possible by not making those attractions the point of the character, any more than the romantic attractions of straight characters are the point of straight characters. Lois Lane and Mary Jane embellished Superman and Spiderman, respectively, by giving them cause and reason and relationships, but you can and do have stories where they barely feature, and where they do not feature at all, because they are not the point of said stories. Gay people like Spider-Man despite him being straight, and not just because Tom Holland is very pretty. Gay people can, in principle, like straight characters for the same reasons. There is no reason why new characters who happen to be gay can't be liked, respected, and admired by straight fans. Sexuality is not the point of these stories, which is why they are, or were anyway, successful. There is something universal about them. Gaying established characters does make sexuality the point, and by making it the point, it robs the majority of the fanbase of meaningful representation in the name of providing gay people with the most hollow and superficial form of representation. It creates a zero-sum, exclusionary game where, again, the vast majority of the fanbase is the portion being excluded. This damages the wider cause of representation, because people don't like being preached at, and they especially don't like having their emotional properties colonized for that purpose. It would be much easier to say of a group of fans who reject a single, well-written, new character who happens to be gay because they are gay, that their animus is motivated by intolerance, bigotry, homophobia, prejudice, or whatever else you want to call it. It wouldn't necessarily be so, but it would rule out a host of other motives. By doing what the modern comics industry has done, transitioning a large number of established characters for no other reason than to preach about sexuality, we cannot make the same claim. There are a myriad of reasons why mainstream fans would find this off-putting that have nothing to do with the character's sexuality. I find it off-putting, and I'm not straight. And it is insulting to them, and to our intelligence generally, to pretend that those who are put off by the transformation of Superman into a holodiversity hire are motivated purely by backward social prejudice. They're not. They're motivated by the fact he's a shit character. It also hardens the attitudes of mainstream fans, who are made to suspect any moves in this area as being primed by the same zealous political obsession of those who've gone about making everyone else gay. That's bad for comics, it's bad for art generally, it's bad for politics, and it's especially bad for gay people, who've been conscripted into a cultural battle we never volunteered for and have no desire to fight in. Unfortunately, it's very hard to see how this will stop. Get woke, go broke is as established a rule in economics as the price system, but comics publishers and their cinematic overlords have demonstrated a remarkable resilience to this fact even in their principal revenue-earning vehicles, while they have already relegated the comics industry to a level far beneath their economic concerns. If you don't look at a product because of the money it will make you, if you've dismissed it as a loss anyway, then there is very little chance that economics will compel you to change your mind. See Star Trek Discovery, for instance. It might be that comics are dead already, and what bits of the industry remain are like the withering trunk of some lifeless tree, present but not animated, and there's nothing that can be done to save them. That would be a great shame for the fans of comics. But the comparative success of other graphic novels, manga in particular, represents salvation of a kind. These are successful precisely because they're not as decadent as comics. They've not exhausted their creative potential. Their writers and their artists have good ideas and good stories to tell, and they tell them well. You'll find gay people in manga, incidentally, both overtly and subtly, leaving enough ambiguity for interpretation rather than forcing anything down your throat. which incidentally is as impolite amongst gays as it is amongst women. Don't force anything down anyone's throat unless they like that kind of thing. And the existence of gay and ambiguous characters in manga hasn't led to the same disastrous effects we've seen in comics, precisely because that is not the sole point of the stories being told, which are by and large well-crafted, interesting, meaningful, engaging, and universal in their own right. As I said at the outset, I'm not a comics fan, I never have been, and it's not my job to tell you what to do with the medium that you love. Some have, I know, set up smaller, alternative and independent labels to keep the tradition alive. If you want to support them, if you can support them, do support them. They look from the outside to be your only salvation, unfortunately. You can rail against Marvel and DC and the abuses they've subjected your industry to, but I can't honestly see how you'll be successful. But perhaps you will be. Stranger things have happened. It might be worth a try. Otherwise, look to manga, look to other graphic novels. The medium is, after all, less important than the story, which is kind of the point of this whole video.